Margaret Thompson sat in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by cardboard boxes and memories. Her mother had passed away 3 months ago, leaving behind a house full of treasures and secrets. At 62, Margaret thought she knew everything about her gentle mother Sarah, who had raised her alone after her father's death when she was just 5 years old. The afternoon sun streamed through dusty windows as Margaret carefully packed her mother's belongings. Books lined every wall of the small bedroom, most of them worn paperbacks that Sarah had read countless times. But there, on the nightstand where it had always been, sat her mother's leather-bound Bible. The cover was cracked with age, its gold lettering faded from decades of handling. Margaret picked up the heavy book, feeling its familiar weight in her hands. She remembered her mother reading from it every morning, her lips moving silently as she turned the thin pages. Sarah had never been particularly religious in the traditional sense, but this Bible had been her constant companion for as long as Margaret could remember. As she opened the cover to look at the family tree written in her mother's careful handwriting, something unexpected happened. The front pages, yellowed and brittle, seemed to separate from the binding. Margaret noticed that several pages had been carefully glued together, creating a hidden pocket within the book itself. Her heart began to race as she gently worked the pages apart. Inside the secret compartment, she found a collection of items that made no sense at all. There were 3 faded photographs of Native American men in traditional dress, a piece of beaded leather that looked incredibly old, and a folded letter written in a language she didn't recognize. But most puzzling of all was a small wooden medallion carved with symbols that seemed to tell a story. The photographs showed the same man at different ages. In the first, he appeared to be a young warrior with fierce eyes and traditional face paint. The second showed him older, standing next to a woman Margaret didn't recognize. The third photograph showed him as an elderly man, his weathered face kind but proud, wearing what appeared to be the ceremonial dress of a chief. Margaret turned the photographs over and found names written in her mother's handwriting. Joseph Running Bear, 1943, Joseph and Anna, 1945, and Chief Joseph Running Bear, 1967. Below the names, her mother had written something that made Margaret's hands tremble. Your grandfather, the truth I could never tell you. The letter was written on official government letterhead from the Bureau of Indian Affairs dated 1944. Though parts of it were in what appeared to be Lakota language, Margaret could make out enough English to understand that it concerned the forced relocation of a family from their tribal lands. The name Joseph Running Bear appeared multiple times throughout the document. Margaret sank onto her mother's bed, her mind reeling. Her grandfather? But that was impossible. Her mother had always told her that both her grandparents had died before she was born, victims of the influenza pandemic in the early 1900s. She had grown up believing she had no extended family, that she and her mother were alone in the world. The beaded leather appeared to be part of a traditional Native American garment, possibly a piece of a ceremonial shirt or dress. The beadwork was intricate, done in patterns of blue, white, and red that seemed to tell a story of their own. As Margaret examined it more closely, she noticed that some of the beads had been repaired with different colored thread, as if someone had lovingly maintained this precious item over many years. The wooden medallion was perhaps the most mysterious item of all. Carved from what looked like cedar, it depicted a series of symbols: a bear, an eagle, flowing water, and mountains. Around the edge were carved words in the same language as parts of the letter. Margaret traced the symbols with her finger, feeling a strange connection to something she had never known existed. As she sat surrounded by these impossible artifacts, Margaret began to remember odd moments from her childhood that suddenly made sense. Her mother's strange knowledge of herbal remedies, the way she could predict weather changes, her unexplained ability to communicate with animals. Sarah had always dismissed these things as old wives' tales or common sense, but now Margaret wondered if there was something much more significant. She remembered how her mother would sometimes speak words in what Margaret had assumed was German, or perhaps Polish, languages from their supposed European heritage. She thought about the dream catchers that had always hung in their home, which Sarah had claimed were simply pretty decorations she had picked up at craft fairs. She recalled her mother's deep respect for nature and her insistence on thanking the earth for everything they received. Margaret also remembered her mother's unusual reaction to Western movies when she was growing up. While other children enjoyed the cowboys and Indians films of the era, Sarah would become visibly upset whenever Native Americans were portrayed negatively. She had always explained this as simple human decency, but Margaret now wondered if it was something much more personal. The afternoon was turning to evening as Margaret sat in her mother's room, holding these revelations in her hands. She felt as though her entire life had been built on a foundation that was suddenly crumbling away. Who was Joseph Running Bear? Why had her mother hidden this part of their family history? And most importantly, what had happened to cause such secrecy? She began to think about her own appearance, something she had never questioned before. Her high cheekbones, her dark hair that never seemed to fade even as she aged, her olive complexion that people often attributed to Italian heritage. Her mother had always encouraged this assumption, never correcting people when they guessed at their ethnic background. Margaret realized that she had accepted her mother's explanations without question, trusting the woman who had raised her with such love and dedication. But now, holding evidence of a completely different family history, she felt both betrayed and protective of her mother's memory. There had to be a reason for such elaborate deception, something important enough to justify hiding the truth for an entire lifetime. The government letter mentioned something called the Indian Relocation Act and referenced a family being processed for urban integration. Margaret had never heard of such a thing, but the official language suggested that whatever had happened to Joseph Running Bear and his family had been sanctioned by the government. The date of 1944 placed it during World War II, a time Margaret knew had been difficult for many American families. As night fell, Margaret carefully returned all the items to their hiding place within the Bible. She needed time to process this discovery, and more importantly, she needed to find someone who could help her understand what these artifacts meant. The photographs, the letter, the beadwork, and the medallion were clearly important, but their significance was lost on her. She decided to start her investigation with the local library, where she could research the names and dates she had found. Perhaps there were records of Joseph Running Bear, or information about what had happened to Native American families during the 1940s. She had always been good at research, a skill she had used in her career as a school librarian, and now she would use it to uncover the truth about her own family. Margaret left her mother's house that evening with more questions than answers, but with a determination to understand why Sarah Thompson had chosen to hide the fact that her daughter was the granddaughter of a Native American war chief. The discovery would lead her on a journey that would change not only how she saw herself, but how she understood the complex history of America itself. Margaret spent the next week at the county library, buried in history books and government documents. What she discovered about the 1940s and Native American families made her stomach turn. The Indian Relocation Act had been a government program designed to move Native Americans from reservations into cities, supposedly to help them assimilate into mainstream American society. In reality, it had torn families apart and destroyed centuries-old cultural connections. The librarian, Mrs. Henderson, had been particularly helpful in locating archived newspaper articles from the local area during the 1940s. Margaret learned that several Native American families had been relocated to their town during that time, placed in jobs at the local munitions factory that had supported the war effort. Most of these families had been from the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, and many had been forced to change their names to sound more American.
Armed with this information, Margaret decided to contact the Bureau of Indian Affairs directly.
After several phone transfers and a week of waiting, she was connected with Dr. Robert Clearwater, a researcher who specialized in relocation records from the 1940s. Dr. Clearwater was himself Native American, a member of the Oglala Lakota tribe, and he understood the sensitivity of Margaret's situation. When Margaret described the documents she had found, Dr. Kira Shadow, Clearwater, became very interested. He asked her to mail copies of the letter and photographs to his office in Denver, promising to research Joseph Running Bear's case personally. 2 weeks later, he called Margaret with information that took her breath away. Joseph Running Bear had been a respected war chief of the Oglala Lakota, known for his efforts to protect his people's traditional ways while also understanding the need to work with the changing world around them. In 1943, when World War II was at its peak, he had volunteered along with many other Native American men to serve in the military. However, because of his leadership role in the tribe, the government had instead asked him to participate in the relocation program as an example to other families. Dr. Clearwater explained that Joseph had been promised that the relocation was temporary, just for the duration of the war. He was told his family would be able to return to the reservation once the conflict ended. Like many Native Americans at the time, he believed that demonstrating loyalty to America during the war would help protect his people's rights and land in the future. Joseph had arrived in Margaret's hometown with his wife Anna and their teenage daughter Sarah in the spring of 1944. He had been given a job at the munitions factory and a small house in what was then considered the immigrant section of town. The family had been instructed to adopt American names and customs to blend in with the other factory workers who had come from various parts of the country to support the war effort. Dr. Clearwater had found employment records showing that Joseph had worked under the name Joe Bear and that he had been an exemplary employee, earning commendations for his work ethic and reliability. Anna had worked part-time as a seamstress, using her traditional skills to alter and repair clothing for other factory families. Their daughter Sarah had enrolled in the local high school under the name Sarah Bear. But the most shocking revelation came when Dr. Clearwater found records indicating that Joseph Running Bear had never intended for the cultural separation to be permanent. He had been secretly documenting traditional stories, songs, and ceremonies, planning to preserve them for future generations. He had also been in communication with other relocated families, trying to maintain connections to their tribal community, even while living in mainstream American society. Dr. Clearwater sent Margaret additional documents that painted a picture of a man torn between two worlds. Joseph had written letters to tribal leaders back on the reservation, describing his family's life in their new town and expressing his hope that they would soon return home. He had also written detailed accounts of traditional ceremonies and stories, apparently determined that this knowledge would not be lost even if his family remained in relocation. The most heartbreaking document was a letter Joseph had written to Sarah in 1947, when she was 18 years old. In it, he expressed his fear that the government would never allow them to return to the reservation, and his worry that Sarah was losing connection to her Lakota heritage. He wrote about the difficulty of watching his daughter date local boys who knew nothing of her true identity, and his sadness that she seemed eager to fully embrace her new American life. Margaret learned that Joseph had died in 1952, still believing that the relocation was temporary. Anna had lived until 1961, working as a seamstress until her death. Throughout their time in the town, they had maintained the fiction that they were simply another immigrant family, never revealing their true heritage to anyone outside their immediate household. Dr. Clearwater was able to provide Margaret with information about her mother's life during those crucial years. Sarah Bear had graduated from high school with honors and had briefly attended the local teachers' college. She had married Margaret's father, Robert Thompson, in 1955, 3 years after Joseph's death. Robert had been a kind man who worked at the post office, and according to the records, he had never known about his wife's Native American heritage. When Robert died in 1961, the same year as Anna, Sarah had been left alone with 5-year-old Margaret. Clearwater speculated that this might have been when Sarah made the conscious decision to completely bury her family's true history. As a young widow in the 1960s, she may have felt that revealing her Native American identity would make life even more difficult for herself and her daughter. Margaret also learned that there had been other relocated families in their town, but that most had eventually either returned to reservations or moved to larger cities where there were bigger Native American communities. Sarah appeared to have been one of the few who had remained, choosing to completely assimilate rather than maintain any connection to her heritage. Dr. Clearwater arranged for Margaret to speak with elderly members of the Oglala Lakota tribe who remembered Joseph Running Bear. Through a series of phone calls, Margaret learned about her grandfather's reputation as a wise and respected leader. She was told stories about his skill as a hunter and his knowledge of traditional medicine. Several people remembered his beautiful singing voice and his ability to tell stories that could make children laugh or teach important life lessons. Most importantly, Margaret learned that Joseph Running Bear had been known for his prophecies. Other tribal members described him as a man who could see into the future, someone whose dreams often came true. They told Margaret that in the months before his relocation, Joseph had spoken of a vision in which his granddaughter would one day return to reclaim their family's heritage and bring honor to their name. The wooden medallion that Margaret had found was identified as a sacred object that had belonged to Joseph's family for generations. The symbols carved into it told the story of their family's spiritual connection to specific animals and natural features of their homeland. Dr. Clearwater explained that such medallions were typically passed down from grandfather to granddaughter, and that Joseph would have considered it one of his most precious possessions. Margaret also learned about the beadwork she had discovered. The piece was identified as part of a traditional woman's dress that would have been worn during important ceremonies. The fact that it had been carefully maintained and repaired over the years suggested that Anna had continued to value these traditional items even while living their American life. As Margaret absorbed all this information, she began to understand the magnitude of the sacrifice her family had made. Joseph and Anna had given up everything they knew and loved, including their names, their language, their community, and their spiritual practices, in the hope of creating a better life for their daughter and future grandchildren. Sarah had continued that sacrifice by completely hiding her heritage, even from her own daughter, perhaps believing that this was the only way to ensure Margaret's success in American society. But Margaret also began to feel a growing anger at the government policies that had forced such impossible choices on Native American families. She learned about the broader impact of relocation programs, how they had disrupted tribal communities and caused the loss of languages, traditions, and cultural knowledge that had been passed down for thousands of years. Dr. Clearwater put Margaret in contact with a tribal historian who specialized in helping people reconnect with their Native American heritage. The historian, Dr. Mary Crow Dog, agreed to meet with Margaret and help her understand what her grandfather's vision might have meant for her life and her future. Margaret realized that her discovery was not just about uncovering her family's past, but about understanding her responsibility to honor their memory and perhaps find a way to bridge the gap between the life her mother had built and the heritage that had been hidden away. The photographs of Joseph running bear seemed to be looking at her across the decades, waiting for her to decide what she would do with the truth she had uncovered. As she prepared to travel to South Dakota to meet with Dr. Crow Dog and visit the Pine Ridge Reservation for the first time in her life, Margaret felt as though she was about to step into a completely different world. She was no longer just Margaret Thompson, the retired librarian from a small Midwestern town. She was the granddaughter of Chief Joseph Running Bear, and that identity came with both privileges and responsibilities she was only beginning to understand. The Pine Ridge Reservation stretched out before Margaret like a different world, vast and beautiful under the endless South Dakota sky. Dr. Mary Crow Dog had insisted on meeting her at the reservation rather than in town, explaining that there were things Margaret needed to see and people she needed to meet who would help her understand what her grandfather's vision truly meant. Margaret had driven the 8 hours from her home with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She carried with her the wooden medallion, the photographs, and the beadwork from her mother's Bible, items that Dr. Crow Dog had requested she bring. As she pulled into the small community center where they had agreed to meet, she saw an elderly woman waiting on the porch, her long grey hair braided with colorful ribbons. Dr. Doc Bentar. Crow Dog was smaller than Margaret had expected, but her presence was commanding. She wore traditional Native American clothing and jewelry that seemed to tell stories of their own. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent a lifetime preserving and protecting cultural knowledge. The first thing Crow Dog did was examine the medallion Margaret had brought. As she held it in her weathered hands, her expression changed to one of amazement and respect. She explained that this particular medallion was not just a family heirloom, but a sacred object that had been blessed by spiritual leaders generations before Joseph Running Bear was born. The symbols carved into it were not just decorative, but represented a specific spiritual responsibility that had been passed down through Joseph's family line. According to tribal tradition, the medallion indicated that Joseph's family had been chosen as keepers of certain sacred stories and ceremonies. This was why his relocation had been such a devastating loss to the tribal community. When he had been forced to leave the reservation, important cultural knowledge had gone with him, knowledge that many had assumed was lost forever. Dr. Crow Dog led Margaret to a small building behind the community center where several elderly tribal members were waiting. These were people who had known Joseph Running Bear personally, some of whom had been children when he left for relocation in 1944. As Margaret listened to their stories, she began to understand the true significance of her grandfather's life and death. An old man named Thomas Spotted Eagle had been Joseph's close friend and had served as an unofficial tribal historian for decades. He told Margaret that Joseph had been much more than just a war chief. He had been a bridge between the old ways and the new world that was rapidly changing around them. Joseph had understood that Native American tribes would need to adapt to survive, but he had also been determined that they would not lose their essential identity in the process. Thomas explained that Joseph's decision to participate in the relocation program had been controversial within the tribe. Some had seen it as betrayal, while others had understood it as a necessary sacrifice. Joseph had promised the tribal elders that he would find a way to preserve their traditions even while living in the white world, and that he would ensure that his family line continued to honor their spiritual responsibilities. The most shocking revelation came when Thomas showed Margaret a collection of letters that had been carefully preserved by the tribal council. These were letters that Joseph had written to tribal leaders throughout his time in relocation, letters that Margaret's mother Sarah had somehow managed to smuggle back to the reservation after Joseph's death. The letters contained detailed descriptions of traditional ceremonies, transcriptions of sacred songs, and stories that had been passed down through generations. Dr. Crowdog explained that these letters had been crucial in helping the tribe maintain certain traditions that might otherwise have been lost. Joseph had not just preserved cultural knowledge for his own family, but had continued to serve his people even while living hundreds of miles away from the reservation. His foresight had helped keep important spiritual practices alive during a time when government policies were actively trying to destroy Native American culture. But the most extraordinary discovery was yet to come. Thomas Spotted Eagle led Margaret to a private room where he showed her a journal that Joseph had kept during his final years. In this journal, Joseph had written detailed accounts of the visions and dreams he had experienced while living in relocation. The dreams had been remarkably specific, describing not only his own death, but also the future of his family line. According to the journal entries, Joseph had foreseen that his daughter Sarah would choose to hide her heritage completely, believing this was necessary to protect her own daughter. But he had also seen that his granddaughter would eventually discover the truth and would face a choice. She could continue to live as Sarah Thompson had taught her, or she could reclaim her identity and fulfill the spiritual responsibilities that came with their family's sacred medallion. The most astounding part of Joseph's vision was his description of what would happen when his granddaughter discovered her heritage. He had written that she would find the hidden items in Sarah's Bible exactly 62 years after his arrival in relocation, which was precisely when Margaret had made her discovery. He had also predicted that she would be led to the reservation by people who would help her understand her true purpose. Dr. Crowdog explained that Joseph's visions had been famous among the tribal elders during his lifetime. Many of his predictions about changes coming to the reservation and the broader world had proven accurate. The fact that his vision about his granddaughter was unfolding exactly as he had foreseen was being interpreted by tribal members as a sign that Margaret had an important role to play in their community's future. Thomas Spotted Eagle revealed that there was more to Margaret's heritage than she had yet learned. The family medallion she carried indicated that she was not just descended from a war chief, but from a line of spiritual leaders who had been responsible for maintaining specific sacred knowledge. If she chose to accept this responsibility, she would become the first person in her family line to actively practice these traditions since Joseph's forced relocation. Margaret was overwhelmed by the implications of what she was learning. The elderly tribal members explained that accepting her spiritual heritage would require her to undergo traditional training and ceremonies. She would need to learn the Lakota language, understand complex spiritual practices, and commit to spending significant time on the reservation working with tribal elders to master knowledge that had been passed down for generations. But they also explained that this was not a decision she had to make immediately. They understood that she had spent 62 years living as Margaret Thompson, and that embracing her identity as the granddaughter of Joseph Running Bear would require major changes in her life. They offered to begin teaching her about Lakota culture and spirituality gradually, allowing her to explore her heritage at her own pace. Dr. Crowdog arranged for Margaret to participate in a traditional ceremony that evening, a ritual designed to help people connect with their ancestral spirits. During this ceremony, Margaret experienced something she had never expected. As the tribal members sang traditional songs and burned sacred herbs, she found herself understanding words in Lakota that she had never learned, and feeling connected to spiritual forces she had never known existed. The ceremony culminated when Margaret was asked to hold her grandfather's medallion while the tribal elders performed a specific ritual that had not been conducted for over 70 years. According to tradition, this ritual could only be performed when all the required sacred objects were present and when a qualified family member was available to receive the spiritual responsibility. As Margaret held the medallion during the ceremony, she experienced what could only be described as a vision. She saw Joseph Running Bear as he had been during his years in relocation, working at the munitions factory during the day, but spending his evenings documenting traditional knowledge and maintaining secret communication with the reservation. She saw her grandmother Anna, carefully preserving beadwork and other cultural items even while living their American life. She saw her mother Sarah, torn between her desire to honor her parents' memory and her determination to protect her daughter from the discrimination she had experienced. But most importantly, Margaret saw herself as Joseph Running Bear had envisioned her in his dreams decades before her birth. She understood that her career as a librarian, Her skills in research and preservation of knowledge, and even her mother's decision to hide their heritage, had all been part of preparing her for this moment. Joseph had seen that she would be the one to bridge the gap between their lost heritage and their family's future. The vision also showed Margaret what her grandfather had seen as her ultimate purpose. She was meant to use her skills and education to help the tribe develop programs that would prevent the loss of cultural knowledge that had occurred during the relocation era. Her background in library science and her understanding of both worlds, Native American and mainstream American, would allow her to create systems for preserving and teaching traditional knowledge to future generations. As the ceremony concluded, Margaret realized that her mother's secret had been both a burden and a gift. Sarah's decision to completely assimilate had given Margaret advantages and opportunities that would now allow her to serve her people in ways that would not have been possible if she had grown up on the reservation. Her education, her financial stability, and her understanding of how mainstream American institutions worked were all tools she could use to help preserve and strengthen Lakota culture. Thomas Spotted Eagle presented Margaret with additional items that had been waiting for her return for over 7 decades. These included Joseph's medicine bag containing herbs and sacred objects he had used in his spiritual practice, and a collection of traditional songs that he had transcribed in both Lakota and English. These items had been held in trust by the tribal council, waiting for the day when Joseph's granddaughter would return to claim her heritage. Dr. Crow Dog explained that Margaret's discovery had already had an impact beyond her own family. Word of her story had spread throughout the Native American community, inspiring other families to research their own histories and reclaim traditions that had been lost during the relocation era. Margaret's willingness to explore her heritage was being seen as a symbol of healing and renewal for communities that had been scattered and damaged by government policies. As Margaret prepared to return home, she carried with her not just the artifacts from her mother's Bible, but also a new understanding of her identity and purpose. She had arranged to take a leave of absence from her retirement activities to spend the next year learning about Lakota culture and working with tribal elders to develop educational programs that would benefit the entire community. The journey back to her hometown felt different than the trip to the reservation had been. Margaret was no longer searching for answers about her family's past, but planning for a future that would honor both her grandfather's vision and her mother's sacrifice. She understood now that Sarah's decision to hide their heritage had not been about rejecting their culture, but about ensuring that Margaret would be positioned to help preserve it for future generations. Margaret Thompson was returning home, but she was also embracing her identity as the granddaughter of Chief Joseph Running Bear. The hidden message in her mother's Bible had led her not just to the truth about her family's past, but to a destiny that would allow her to serve as a bridge between worlds, just as her grandfather had envisioned in his dreams over 70 years before.